The room was silent until the chain creaked. A light flickered over a table of maps, each line drawn not with ink, but with the idea of conquest. In Berlin, a man leaned forward, his pale eyes reflecting the flicker of empire. In Moscow, another man stared at a portrait of himself, motionless as a statue carved from fear. Between them stretched a continent that would soon drown in blood. They were never friends, not even allies. They were two predators circling the same prey, each believing himself chosen by history to devour the world. Yet for a brief, deceitful moment, they shook hands. The year was 1939. Europe held its breath. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in secret halls smelling of ink, leather, and lies. It was not a treaty. It was a death warrant disguised as diplomacy. Hitler, the restless painter turned messiah of hate, saw it as a stepping stone to the east. Stalin, the cautious priest of paranoia, saw it as time bought with blood he did not yet wish to spill. They spoke the same language of ambition, though one called it destiny, the other called it defense. Under the polished chandeliers of Moscow, foreign ministers exchanged toasts over documents that divided Poland like a carcass. Beneath their words, a darker understanding flickered. This peace would last only long enough for betrayal to ripen. Hitler smiled because he believed the Soviet Union would never be ready. Stalin smiled because he believed he could outwait anyone. Both were wrong. The world looked away. Britain and France were still reeling from the betrayal of Munich. America slept behind oceans. And so, in September 1939, the pact of monsters came alive. Germany struck west into Poland. The Soviet Union struck east. Towns vanished overnight. Citizens taken by trucks with no return routes. Children learned new anthems. Priests were shot for old prayers. Fear became law. To the world, Hitler seemed unstoppable. His armies a storm of precision and will. But beneath the steel and banners was a fragile mind, chained to delusion. He saw history not as chance, but as prophecy written by his own hand. The Slavic lands, he told his generals, were the soil of destiny, the space where the German race would bloom. His ideology was his map, his hatred his compass. In the Kremlin, Stalin listened to reports through the fog of distrust. His spies warned him that Hitler's friendship was an illusion, that beneath the handshake hid the dagger. But Stalin no longer trusted his spies. He had executed too many of them. His purges had hollowed out the Red Army, silencing the very men who could have saved it. Fear had eaten his vision. Each man was driven by ghosts. Hitler by the ghost of the trenches, mud, defeat, humiliation. Stalin by the ghost of revolution, betrayal, survival, control. Both saw weakness as sin, mercy as death. Both believed terror could forge strength. And both, in their own way, were right, until terror turned inward. In 1940, Hitler watched his armies march through Europe like a storm given form. France fell in weeks. London burned in nights. He stood at the height of his power, yet his eyes always drifted east. Beyond the forests and rivers, he saw the land he desired, not just for empire, but for annihilation. The Slavs were, in his words, subhuman. The Jews, the communists, the undesirables, all threads to be cut from history's cloth. Stalin watched from the shadows, convinced that Hitler needed him, that their pact was real. He sent trains of oil, grain, and iron to the Reich, feeding the very machine that would soon crush him. He thought himself untouchable, hidden behind the walls of the Kremlin, where even his footsteps were measured in fear. Every night, he signed execution lists. Every morning, he demanded new reports of loyalty. Paranoia was his only friend. In both capitals, silence became the language of rule. Hitler's officers feared his rages. Stalin's ministers feared his doubts. No one dared speak truth. Truth had become treason. And so both regimes rotted beneath their own perfection. By 1941, the illusion could not hold. The German High Command whispered of the coming invasion, Operation Barbarossa, a plan so vast it defied comprehension. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would fall like a rotten tree, its roots weakened by purges and lies. "We have only to kick in the door," he told his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." In Moscow, The warnings multiplied. Soviet agents in Berlin, Tokyo, even London sent the same message. Germany would strike soon. But Stalin refused to believe. He called it a British provocation, a Western trick meant to drag him into war. His fear of deceit blinded him to the truth. The greatest deceiver was already inside his gates. Spring melted into summer. Along the border, German soldiers sharpened their bayonets and whispered prayers to gods they no longer believed in. Soviet patrols reported movement, columns of armor hidden in forests, supply trains humming at night. But their words vanished into bureaucracy. The Red Army stood unready, like a giant drugged by denial. And then, one quiet morning, the horizon burned. June 22nd, 1941. The invasion began. But that moment still sleeps ahead, beyond the curtain of dawn, beyond the pride of men who mistook terror for strength. For now, in the dim corridors of Berlin and Moscow, two hands hover over two maps. Each believes he is the master of history. Each believes he controls fear. Neither understands that fear has already chosen its victor. And so history waits, cold, patient, merciless, watching the two monsters who mirror each other, watching as hatred sharpens its blade in silence. For beneath the paper treaties and speeches, beneath the flags and anthems, one truth endures. They called it peace. But peace built on fear is only war pretending to sleep. The horizon burned red long. Before sunrise, the sky itself seemed to bleed, as if dawn refused to rise over what humanity was about to do. On the morning of June 22nd, 1941, the silence of the eastern frontier shattered beneath 1,000 engines. Tanks rolled like thunder. The air quivered under the roar of Stukas diving toward sleeping villages. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the greatest invasion in human history, and the beginning of Hitler's end. For months, the German army had gathered in the shadows, assembling 3 million men across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They waited under the false glow of friendship. Smiling across the border, they would soon cross with fire. Stalin had ignored every warning, every intercepted message, every plea from his generals. He believed it was a trick, a trap set by the British to draw him into a needless war. Even as the first shells fell on Brest Fortress, he refused to believe it was real. But the world does not wait for belief. By the time Stalin awoke to truth, his empire was already burning. German columns moved like a mechanical tide, sweeping to the plains of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic. Villages vanished in hours. Roads clogged with civilians. Peasants, women, children. Fleeing east, their carts piled what little life they could carry. Behind the lines, the SS followed, turning conquest into extermination. They called them cleansing operations. They shot Jews, partisans, and prisoners in fields and forests that will remember every bullet long after history forgot their names. Hitler watched with pride. To him, this was not war, it was revelation. He saw himself as an artist of destiny, painting the map of Europe in red. His generals begged him to focus on logistics, on supplies, on the hard science of warfare. But he was not listening. He believed ideology would triumph where reason could not. The Slavs, he declared, would kneel before the German will. The Soviet Union would crumble within weeks. The East, he told his inner circle, would become Germany's new frontier, cleansed and reborn. Stalin, meanwhile, retreated into silence. For 3 days after the invasion began, the Kremlin was paralyzed. Ministers whispered in corridors, too afraid to speak the truth aloud. When Stalin finally addressed his people, his voice was heavy, uncertain, stripped of its usual iron. "Comrades," he said, "our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated." It was both a promise and a prayer. Yet the enemy did not slow. German divisions reached the gates of Minsk within days. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled, captured, executed. The air was filled with the smell of oil and death. Columns of smoke marked where cities once stood. The blitzkrieg had returned, faster, stronger, more merciless than ever. But beneath the triumph, something began to stir. The Wehrmacht, so confident in its precision, began to feel the weight of the endless steppe, the depth of the Russian soul that refused to surrender. The further east they marched, the more the land itself turned against them. Roads dissolved into mud. Supplies thinned. The sun burned by day and the cold bit by night. Soldiers began to wonder how far this victory would carry them before it broke them. Behind them, the Einsatzgruppen's massacres grew in scale, poisoning even their victories with horror. Some wrote in their letters home of terrible sights, of work we cannot speak of. They did not yet know they were building the moral grave of their nation. In Moscow, the Red Army began to awaken. Stalin replaced cowardice with terror, issuing orders that no one retreat, no matter the cost. Deserters were shot. Civilians were conscripted. The NKVD stood behind the soldiers with pistols drawn, ready to execute any who turned back. Fear became weapon, and that weapon began to work. The same brutality that had paralyzed the nation now forced it to move. Factories in the Urals ran without pause. Women, children, and the elderly worked until their hands bled, forging tanks and bullets from the ashes of cities. Trains carried industry itself eastward, whole machines uprooted from the soil of Europe and replanted behind the Ural Mountains. It was chaos, but it was survival. The Soviet people began to fight not for Stalin, not for ideology, but for existence itself. As the Germans approached Smolensk, the rhythm of their advance began to falter. Resistance grew, slower but more determined. Villages burned themselves rather than feed the invader. Peasants poured gasoline into their own wells, scorched their fields, killed their livestock. Anything to deny the Germans their comfort. The army of conquest found itself marching through desolation. Still, Hitler pressed on. He saw no limits, no reason to stop. He demanded Moscow, Kiev, Leningrad, all at once. His generals pleaded for focus, for restraint, for patience. But Hitler was not a general. He was a prophet intoxicated by his own prophecy. Each victory deepened his delusion. Each burning city fed his belief that destiny itself was German. In the forest near Smolensk, Soviet soldiers began to ambush supply lines, their rifles cold in their hands. They struck at night, melted into the trees, leaving only silence and blood. German soldiers began to fear the dark. They began to sense that this land did not die when conquered. It waited. By autumn, the horizon had changed again. Smoke no longer rose from conquered cities. It rose from German camps trying to stay warm. Frost formed on the barrels of their rifles. Fuel began to freeze. Their uniforms were thin, their boots torn. The blitzkrieg had run out of breath. And yet still, Hitler refused to yield. He demanded that his armies push onward, to Moscow, before the winter closed its fist. They obeyed, as they always did, and marched into the storm. The snow came early that year. It fell over corpses and broken machines, over towns where no one lived anymore. It fell on both armies alike, German and Soviet, conqueror and conquered, erasing the difference between them. The once invincible Wehrmacht now trudged through snowdrifts, starving, frostbitten, still clutching the delusion that willpower could defeat nature. Stalin's city stood waiting behind walls of ice. Its streets were lined with rubble, its citizens hollow with hunger. Yet the people of Moscow did not run. They dug trenches with bare hands. They built barricades from frozen earth. They listened to Stalin's words broadcast through the frost, and for once they believed not in him, but in endurance. Then the unthinkable happened. The German advance stopped. For the first time since the war began, Hitler's army could go no further. The tanks froze, the men froze, and the dream of empire froze with them. The blitzkrieg had met its grave, and it was frozen. And somewhere in the white silence of the Russian winter, the first crack appeared in the myth of invincibility. The same arrogance that had lit the world on fire now stood trembling in the snow, unaware that from this point on, every step forward would lead only deeper into ruin. History exhaled slowly, like a beast waiting to strike again. For though the fire had dimmed, it was far from gone, and its next battlefield would bear a single name that would break one tyrant and immortalize another. By 1942, the war had devoured everything: nations, armies, and illusions of invincibility. The earth itself seemed to bleed from its wounds. Cities lay hollow, filled with dust where voices used to be. And yet, amid the desolation, two men still dreamed of empire. Hitler saw the East as unfinished business. Stalin saw survival as victory enough. Between them lay a city that would swallow them both, Stalingrad. It began not as destiny, but as arrogance. After failing to take Moscow, Hitler turned his gaze south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. He needed fuel to keep the war machine alive. Yet when his generals urged him to focus on strategy, he chose symbolism. Stalingrad, he said, must fall. The name alone taunted him, a city bearing his rival's name. It wasn't just a target, it was a challenge. In the summer heat, German columns rolled once more into the endless steppe. Dust rose behind their tanks like ghosts following a funeral march. They were confident again, fed by months of victories, blind to what awaited them. Stalingrad, they were told, was just another city. But the city on the Volga was not made of stone. It was made of will. From the Kremlin, Stalin gave his order, not one step back. Every soldier, every factory worker, every civilian knew what those words meant. Retreat was death by bullet, by execution, or by shame. The city became a fortress of flesh and concrete. Women carried rifles. Children filled sandbags. Priests blessed machine guns. Every street became a battlefield. Every building, a tomb. When the Luftwaffe arrived, it erased the skyline in a single day. Thousands of bombs turned homes into rubble. Smoke darkened the river. Heat cracked the very air. But beneath the ruins, life clung stubbornly on. The Soviets dug tunnels, basements, and trenches through the wreckage. They called it rat war. Combat measured in meters, fought among corpses and shattered walls. German soldiers advanced block by block, thinking each ruin would be the last. Yet every ruin gave birth to another defense. They learned too late that Stalingrad could not be taken. It could only be bled for. They fought in factories where machines stood twisted and silent, in stairwells slick with blood, in rooms where one floor belonged to the Germans and the next to the Soviets. The smell of iron and decay hung heavy, as if the city itself were rusting from within. Amid the carnage, the Volga ran red. Soviet reinforcements crossed it under constant fire, boats splintering, men sinking beneath the water's skin. But they came anyway, again and again, because behind them was Stalin's order and before them was annihilation. Fear and patriotism had become indistinguishable. They fought not for ideology, but because nothing human was left but resistance. Hitler watched from afar, blind to the suffering his pride demanded. He ordered every street captured, every house held, as if concrete could grant immortality. When his generals begged to retreat, he raged. To retreat from Stalingrad, he said, would be to retreat from destiny. To him, this city of rubble was a test of will, a personal duel with the man he despised most. He could not see that in fighting Stalin's name, he was fighting his own fate. By autumn, the German Sixth Army was trapped inside the skeleton of the city. Their supply lines stretched thin across a continent frozen in mud. Winter crept closer, quiet and merciless. Rations dwindled. Ammunition ran dry. The once proud army of the Reich now shivered in the ruins it had made. Soldiers burned furniture to stay warm, ate the flesh of dead horses, and stared into fires as though hoping to see home reflected there. And then the snow returned. From the steppe beyond the city, the Red Army struck back. The counteroffensive came like an avalanche, sudden, cold, unstoppable. Soviet tanks surrounded Stalingrad in a ring of steel, cutting off every escape. The hunters had become the hunted. Within weeks, the Sixth Army was encircled, 100,000 men trapped in a frozen graveyard. Stalin's generals watched the trap tighten, their revenge unfolding inch by inch. But it was not victory born of genius. It was victory born of endurance. The Soviets had learned to outlast death itself. In the Kremlin, Stalin smiled for the first time in months. His rival had overreached, and the gods of war had turned their gaze. Inside the city, the suffering deepened. German soldiers wrote letters that would never reach home. "The frost eats us," one wrote. "We are no longer men." Corpses froze where they fell, standing like statues in the snow. Commanders pleaded with Hitler to allow surrender, but his reply was the same: not a step back. The mirror of his enemy's command. Pride had devoured them both. By February 1943, silence had returned to Stalingrad. The fighting stopped not because peace was made, but because there was no one left to fight. The once mighty Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was gone. Only 90,000 remained to surrender. Most would never see their homes again. They vanished into Soviet camps, swallowed by the same vastness they had tried to conquer. When the news reached Berlin, Hitler locked himself away. He blamed his generals, the weather, the cruelty of fate. Anything but himself. He could not accept that his empire had met its first true defeat, not by weapons, but by the limits of his own pride. In Moscow, the bells rang. For the first time, the people of the Soviet Union lifted their heads from despair. They had endured the unendurable. Stalingrad was not just a victory, it was a resurrection. Yet even in triumph, the price was unbearable. The city was a graveyard of 2 million souls. Mothers buried sons beside strangers. Fathers returned to find nothing left to rebuild. The snow melted, revealing bones where gardens once bloomed. And in that silence, the war shifted. The invincible Reich had been broken, not just in battle, but in spirit. The myth of German destiny had frozen to death on the banks of the Volga. But history, relentless as winter, was not finished. The fall of Stalingrad did not end the war. It only changed its shape. What began as conquest had become vengeance. What began with 2 tyrants now became a struggle to decide which of them would outlast the other. For in the ruins of Stalingrad, something terrible was born, a truth that would haunt the world long after the smoke cleared. The fire of hatred could not be contained. It would burn all the way to Berlin. Berlin was dying. The air itself seemed to rot with the stench of smoke and surrender. By 1945, the empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga was reduced to a maze of ruins and ghosts. Streets that once echoed with marching boots now lay silent under falling ash. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. In the cold depths of his bunker, Adolf Hitler still clung to fantasy. Maps lay before him, drawn with trembling hands, covered in armies that no longer existed. He spoke of divisions that were gone, of victories that had never happened. The Führer who had once commanded millions now ruled over concrete walls and shadows. His voice, once thunderous, was reduced to a hoarse whisper, a ghost arguing with history. Above him, Berlin was burning. Soviet shells fell like judgment, each explosion erasing another promise of greatness. The Red Army had come from the east with a vengeance born at Stalingrad. Every soldier carried ghosts. The frozen dead of the Volga, the murdered families of Belarus, the ashes of Kiev. They did not march for ideology now. They marched for memory. In Moscow, Stalin watched the destruction unfold with the cold patience of a man who had learned that time was the sharpest weapon of all. His empire was vast, rebuilt on bones, yet he found no joy in victory. He had seen too much to believe in triumph. But he wanted one thing above all, to see his rival erased from the earth. To him, Berlin was not just a capital. It was a mirror he meant to shatter. As Soviet tanks crawled through the city's ruins, the people of Berlin descended into a private hell. Mothers hid in cellars with their children, praying the walls would hold. Soldiers too young to shave clutched rifles they barely knew how to use. The once fearful Gestapo now fled their own streets. The machinery of terror had turned inward. The hunter had become the prey. Hitler's court disintegrated around him. His generals argued, his ministers deserted, his mistress wept quietly in the corner. He ordered counterattacks that no one carried out. He spoke of salvation, of secret weapons, of miracles that would never come. Even now, in the final collapse, he could not see that fear, the very tool he had wielded, was consuming him. He had built an empire on obedience, but obedience cannot survive despair. Outside, the Red Army reached the Reichstag. The building stood shattered, its columns broken like the ribs of a dying beast. Soviet soldiers raised a red flag over its ruins, and for a moment, the war seemed to hold its breath. Millions had died for this image, for the triumph of endurance over cruelty. But beneath that flag lay a darker truth. One tyrant had fallen only for another to rise stronger. Inside the bunker, Hitler faced his final hour. Reports of Soviet troops just blocks away drifted down like whispers of fate. He sat at a table, his hands shaking, dictating a testament that blamed everyone but himself. In his delusion, he saw himself as martyr, not monster. He refused surrender, refused reality. When the time came, he took his life in silence. The man who had demanded worship died afraid of capture. Hidden beneath the city he promised would never fall. Above, the gun stopped briefly. Smoke rose from the ruins in slow, black columns, like prayers no god would answer. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich was ash. And yet, even as the echoes of collapse faded, another shadow lengthened across Europe. The shadow of Stalin. He had won, but victory for Stalin was only another kind of war. The same iron paranoia that had crippled him before now turned outward. He saw enemies in every ally, traitors in every friend. The gulags filled again, not with fascists, but with his own people. He rebuilt an empire of silence. While Hitler ruled by frenzy, Stalin ruled by fear's memory. One had burned fast and bright. The other endured, cold and slow, like frost that never melts. The world they left behind was divided not by borders, but by terror. East and West stood staring across a scar of ideology, each claiming moral right, each haunted by the same disease, control through fear. The war had ended, but its language had survived. Armies no longer marched, but suspicion did. Bombs no longer fell, but the silence of distrust was louder than thunder. And yet, amid the ruin, humanity stirred. Survivors emerged from cellars and camps, blinking against the pale light of peace. They walked among the ruins, searching for faces that would never return. In the stillness of spring, the flowers bloomed again, on graves and craters between the bones of fallen cities. The world began to breathe, but it did not forget. History would later call it victory. The flags, the parades, the photographs, all spoke of triumph. But beneath those celebrations lay something quieter, something more honest. It was not victory that saved the world. It was exhaustion. Mankind had looked into the abyss of its own creation and stepped back, trembling. Both dictators were gone, but their echoes remained. Hitler had died in fire. Stalin would die years later in silence, surrounded by men too afraid to save him as he collapsed on his own carpet. In the end, both were devoured by the very fear they had used to rule others. Their empires have been built on hatred, and hatred has no foundation. It only sinks. The century moved on. Cities rebuilt. Children were born who would never know the sound of sirens or the taste of rationed bread. But under every monument, under every speech of peace, lay the bones of lessons still unlearned. The machinery of fear never truly rusts. It waits for the next hand willing to turn it. In the ruins of Berlin and the silence of Moscow, the same question still lingers. How far will humanity go when led by fear disguised as faith? History cannot answer. It can only remember. The ashes have cooled, the flags have faded. But the truth remains. They ruled through terror, they perished through pride, and they left behind a world forever warned. They called it victory, but history calls it warning.